Hi, this is Naveen Nanjundappa. Welcome to this class again. Now we are going to talk about the Scrum framework, the events, and the applicability of the Scrum framework. To begin with, the Scrum framework is governed by the Scrum Guide, which is a set of rules and guidelines. The latest version is 2020 release, in which the framework defines certain events and the purpose of these events. So let us go ahead and understand the purpose of these events. The first one is, as the time progresses, the first thing that happens in a sprint is called as sprint planning meeting. During the sprint planning meeting, we have three parts: why we are going to work on it, on the goal, what is the goal that we are going to work on, and the plan to reach the goal. How are we planning to reach the goal? So during the sprint planning meeting, the developers, along with the product owner, identify the sprint goal. They connect it with the product goal, which is a bigger objective. Now, keeping the sprint goal in their thoughts, the developers will pull the product backlog items that meet the sprint goal into the planning. This eventually leads to the plan to reach the goal. The set of activities the team has planned on the product backlog items they have pulled during the sprint planning meeting results as the sprint backlog, the to-do list for the sprint and the goal to achieve, purely decided by the developers, and anybody in the organization can help them achieve this. It is good to involve the subject matter experts and other people who can contribute and help the teams plan better. But it is up to the team's decision to get them involved as and when it is necessary. The accountability of the plan is with the developers. The product owner sets the goal, which is the direction in which the team has to move towards inspecting and adapting. And then the Scrum Master helps the team to plan effectively, keeping all the designs, the mitigations of risks, identifications of dependencies, and working collaboratively towards achieving the goal. By the end of the sprint planning meeting, the developers could be able to explain the product owner, the scrum master, and all the stakeholders what is their goal and how they intend to reach the goal with their plan. This is a maximum of 8 hours for a 4-week sprint or a 1 month long sprint, and you could reduce it appropriately for a shorter duration. Then the developers on a daily basis inspect and adapt towards reaching the goal, and every day they look for the incremental changes or the inspection and adaptations. They inspect the plan and adapt their plan towards reaching the goal which they have set during the sprint planning meeting. During this, the developers have all the rights to relook at their plan, change the plan, and adapt their plan, keeping the objective of reaching the goal and the functionality that they have coherently identified. This coherent functionality that they're going to build by end of the sprint is going to help them inspect and adapt towards the product development. So the purpose of the daily scrum is to inspect and adapt the plan towards reaching the goal. The scrum master facilitates and helps the team to be effective and efficient during the daily scrum. The accountability of conducting the daily scrum is with the developers. The product owner is optional, but the product owners can participate as a silent observer without disturbing the team. If the team decides that they need to do a detailed planning, they could always discuss after the daily scrum. Daily scrum is a maximum of 15 minutes discussion between the developers for adapting their plan, done at the same time, same place, every day, in order to reduce the complexity. This eliminates all other meetings so that the teams are effectively focused on the goal. After this, on the last day of the sprint, we have the sprint review. The sprint review is reviewing the product increment that has been developed so far. During this period, the product owner, the stakeholders, look at the product increment and strategically decide what are the feedbacks and updates that needs to be done on the product. Typically, the changes on the product increment results as a new product backlog item or changes in the existing product backlog item. The priority, the identification of new risks can also be added into the existing product backlog. Eventually, the product owner evaluates and forecasts how the product is evolving towards the release and the objectives of the product, the goal set for a release. It is up to the product owner to decide on what are the strategic changes that the product owner has to do. The changes with respect to the release strategy, the changes with respect to the product priorities, and the objectives is solely dependent on the decisions by the product owner. And the product owner makes necessary changes during the sprint review and forecast their happening. The last event during the sprint is a sprint retrospective. Sprint retrospective is a continuous improvement. The last day of the sprint, the team, the Scrum team basically, looks at how they have been working with respect to people, process, tools, techniques, strategies, and look for continuous improvement in these areas. The resultant could be improved process, new techniques, strategies to try out, more stringent definition of done, adding new items to the definition of done that the team thinks is capable of finishing during the sprint for the product increment, action items for the next sprints coming up, and the collaboration that is required for the teams to continuously improve. There are various tools and techniques that one can use during the retrospective. The Scrum Master can make the retrospective really interesting and transparent for everybody to focus on continuous improvement. Held at the last day of the sprint, this is a 3-hour discussion for a 1-month long sprint. While the sprint review is 4 hours for a 1-month long sprint, sprint retrospective is a maximum of 3 hours for a 4-week sprint, 1 month long. These are the 4 events that takes place in Scrum, and these events have specific timeline. While the whole sprint is itself the 5th event, the sprint is a unit of time wherein the team inspects and adapts. This sprint is basically a cycles of inspect and adapt. During this process of inspecting and adapting and getting prepared for the sprint planning meeting, the teams take out some amount of time during the current week or a current sprint and perform the product backlog refinement, product backlog management. The product backlog management is an activity wherein the product owner along with the developers and other stakeholders can refine the product backlog items with respect to the acceptance criteria, the risks and dependencies, the purpose of the product backlog item, the value it creates, and understand if the product backlog item is small enough to be inspected and adapted during the sprint. During the product backlog refinement, if the product backlog item is big, the team members break the requirement into smaller chunks that are potentially inspect adaptable during the sprint, which is the main purpose of the product backlog refinement, to understand the requirement and break it down into a state which is small and ready to start working. After all these things, the sprint continues one after the other. And we have the three sprints, the first one, the second, and the third. Each sprint continues with the same events over a period of time. So, the context of Scrum is you have a fixed time and regular cadence of these events. The team members break the requirement into smaller chunks that is inspect adaptable within this fixed duration. They build the product with the sprint planning meeting. They review the product during the sprint review. They inspect and adapt on their plan every day towards reaching the goal and increasing the probability of reaching the goal. They perform continuous improvement every sprint retrospective, and the cycle repeats. The sprint and its events are independent of the release cycle. The release could be on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or ad hoc, or even on a value driven basis. That's completely described in another video, which is release strategies. Now, you need to understand that release strategy is purely the product owner's decision when to release the product to the user. Sprint only talks about inspecting and adapting on a product increment. Now you can look at the sprint as if it is a cycles of inspect and adapt. So we have plan, do, check and act, inspecting, adapting. Plan, do, check and act, inspecting, adapting, and this cycle repeats. So it's a cycles of inspect and adapt. Inspecting, adapting on the plan, inspecting, adapting on the product, inspecting, adapting on people, process, tool, technique, strategies as a continuous improvement. So we embed the whole point of inspect and adapt into the Scrum framework. And during this period, you can look at inspect and adapt cycles as a process of empirical process or empiricism. During this period, the Scrum framework can be linked to the same cycles of inspect and adapt with the events. You know that the Scrum events, the sprint planning meeting, the daily Scrum, the review, and the retrospective are all focused towards inspecting and adapting. So it is a cycle of inspect and adapt, plan, do, check and act. And then the next cycle of plan, do, check and act. So you can eventually look at sprint as a inspect and adapt loop and the events in Scrum as the opportunities for the teams to inspect and adapt. So in simple terms, inspect and adapt is the core aspect of the Scrum. If you remove inspect and adapt from the Scrum framework, it is going to result in a pure command and control. Think about it. You remove inspect and adapt from sprint planning meeting, it becomes a plan driven approach and a command and control. You remove inspect and adapt from daily Scrum, it results in reporting structure. Remove inspect and adapt from sprint review, it is just a sign off of the work done. If you remove inspect and adapt from retrospective, there is no improvement at all. In fact, inspect and adapt is the essential part of Scrum and the mindset required for every individual and organization using Scrum. Now, let us look at how the Scrum framework will be applicable. For this, we need to get into what is called as Stacey diagram. The Stacey diagram talks about various different parameters that you would potentially fall under. We have two axes of uncertainties. The two axes of uncertainties are going to be one axis of uncertainty which goes from being highly certain to being highly uncertain, which is the requirement axis. The requirement axis talks about what needs to be done, while the technology or the domain axis is where you have the certainty on the domain or uncertainty on the domain. And depending on these two variables, we have four different zones that gets created. And those are, the first zone is where the requirements are highly certain, the technology is highly certain, which means the team members know what to do and the team members also know how to work on it. That's called as a simple project, simple zone. In simple zone, anything will work. Anything will work. Waterfall, V model, Scrum, Kanban, any framework will work. In fact, no framework will also work. Why? Because this is a zone where the team members know what to do and how to achieve it. Very simple, very easy to work on. On the other side, you have chaos, where nothing works. Chaos is a zone where the requirements are highly uncertain and the technology is highly uncertain. In this case, we usually call this boundary as a God save you boundary. None of the frameworks will eventually work for chaos. You need to bring the chaos into a manageable situation. And that is where the next segments come into picture. You have one axis certain and the other axis moderately uncertain, and these are complicated ecosystems. In a complicated ecosystem, either the requirements or the technology will have the challenges and requires an inspect and adapt cycle. Let us look at an example. The team is crystal clear on cloud computing architecture, but the customer does not have a clarity on the requirements of their product. That's a typical example of a complicated ecosystem. Or the customer is crystal clear on IoT product and their requirements, but the team does not have the sufficient technology or a domain expertise to work on it, and they need some POCs and inspect and adapt cycles in the technology area for developing the product. The both cases are complicated. Now let us look at the area which is available now, and that is the complex zone. The complex zone is where you have both axes moderately uncertain. The requirement is moderately uncertain, the technology is moderately uncertain. And in this zone, we always know that we need to inspect and adapt on both the axes. So we need to inspect and adapt, we need to repeat this frequently and also take effective and efficient actions. In fact, when we start looking at inspect and adapt and the frequency of inspect and adapt, what comes to our mind is the Scrum framework. And we just noticed that in Scrum, everything is related to inspect and adapt and the frequency. So we can get to a point where Scrum framework is best suited for a complex zone. Complex zone needs inspect and adapt. Scrum gives you an inspect and adapt. And that is how Scrum is best suited for a complex zone. Of course, it can be used for other zone, but then the best use is in a complex zone. And this comes to two of the products. One, anybody who says that we are using Scrum should understand that the product backlog, the requirements, could be uncertain and there are changes that will come into the requirements. And those changes should be welcome, and Scrum tells you how to handle those changes effectively as part of the inspect and adapt loops. The technology is also uncertain or the domain is uncertain moderately. So the team members might have to do repeated checks in the terms of inspect and adapt as POCs or experiments. And these things are taken into account while they are focused on the results. And that brings us to a point where we understand both Scrum and the empirical thinking of inspect and adapt. Scrum is best suited in a complex zone, and Scrum is the cycles of inspect and adapt. As a heartbeat of the Scrum, we have inspect and adapt loops in the name of sprints. The frequency of the sprints is fixed, and the team works towards achieving an incremental development of the product and experiment and inspect and adapt during the shorter duration of time so that they can reduce the risk and reduce the cost of fix and eventually lead to the goal of the product. This is Naveen. I hope you found this class interesting so far. If you have any questions, please leave the comment below. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have still not subscribed, go ahead, like and subscribe this video. Thank you.